I know. Omni, where have you been, man? Well, I've just been very busy, but I'm back and hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. So today I'm going to be talking about who would win between Sasori and Deidara. This is a fight I really wanted to talk about for a long time, as many people have expressed their own opinion on who would win between these two. The majority saying Deidara would win, while very few say Sasori would win. Before going to the result, I will briefly go over both characters, mentioning some of their feats and scaling. I'll also be going over 3 versions of Sasori, that being his Hiriko puppet, him using the third Kazekage puppet, and his own puppet body. To start off the video, let's talk about Sasori, as he's more difficult amongst the two to really scale due to his lack of feats and showings. As it should already be known by now, Sasori's scaling really depends on how you interpret the narrative of his lore, the most important fact being that he killed the third Kazekage, a shinobi that was stated to be very powerful and even possessed the Iron Sand, which hard counters any puppeteer, as once the sand makes contact with a puppet, it makes it unusable, meaning that when Sasori fought him, he was able to overcome this disadvantage. However, many tend to speculate that Sasori sneak attacked him due to there being no evidence on how the fight went down, but there's a databook statement that calls the third Kazekage a difficult opponent that Sasori defeated, indicating that Sasori did in fact fight the third Kazekage, otherwise the book wouldn't have classified him as such. And even if you want to argue that Sasori only won because of his poison, he still needed to physically harm the third Kazekage for it to take effect. So regardless of what you think, Sasori did in fact beat the third Kazekage, making him one of the strongest Sand Shinobi of all time. And despite his quote-unquote loss to Chiyo and Sakura, it's quite clear that Sasori is very strong, not to mention how more powerful he became once he turned himself into a puppet. Aside from no longer being human, he obtained the ability to control 100 puppets at once. Sasori even stated to have destroyed an entire country with them, a feat that is comparable to the likes of the Sani in their prime, given the statement made by Hiruzen in part 1 about how Orochimaru could destroy a small country on his own, making Sasori an overall powerful shinobi despite his lack of showings. As for Deidara, he's viewed as one of the stronger members of the Akatsuki. This is due to his showing in the series where he demonstrates levels of skill that even allow him to combat against Kage level opponents. Some of his best ones come from his fights against Gaara and Sasuke. Now with Gaara, this fight against Deidara happened in the early parts of Shippuden, so it's safe to say that Gaara at the time wasn't nearly as strong as he was during the 5 Kage Summit, but he was still very powerful, at least in comparison to other Sand Shinobi. This is clearly implied when Baki straight up tells Kankuro that he was no match for Deidara due to him being able to defeat Gaara. Furthermore, Deidara establishes clear dominance over him by easily evading most of his attacks and using his sand defense against him, with him even admitting prior that he underestimated Gaara and wasn't prepared for him, yet still was able to defeat him and considered capturing him alive to be the hard part, making it clear that Gaara wasn't much of a match for him. And his fight with Sasuke really pushed his scaling to being compared to the Sani, legendary shinobi that are implied to possess power so immense that they're on a level of their own. But due to the narrative and feats displayed by Sasuke, many consider him beyond that level. And in the fight between the two, Deidara put up a great fight against Sasuke, so much so that even Sasuke admits that Deidara was a lot stronger than he expected, showing that Deidara is a very powerful shinobi. So, starting off, we have Deidara versus Sasori and his Hiriko puppet. This fight could be summed up based off one statement made by Deidara early in the series, which claimed that Sasori is stronger than himself. This statement, however, is contentious to many, as some people argue that Deidara only said this with the intention of separating Kakashi from Naruto, as when Deidara took Gaara's corpse to bait Naruto into chasing him, he only mentioned Sasori's strength when Kakashi appeared alongside him. This wouldn't be out of character by Deidara, as we already know that he's very strategical and will use anything he can to his advantage, even at the cost of his own body. However, many dislike this argument since it leads too much into one's interpretation, and instead argue that Deidara was actually telling the truth about Sasori, which would give Kakashi reason to leave Naruto to help Sakura and Chiyo, making it much easier to complete his objective, which is a fair point to make. But let's just say we exclude the statement and go off the feats of Hiriko. What would be the result? Well, it doesn't really end well for the puppet, considering that his feats are pretty much non-existent. We only see this puppet in 2 fights, one of them being an off-screen panel fight against Kankuro where he defeats him, the other being against Chiyo and Sakura for 1 chapter, and during the fight, both Sakura and Chiyo dodge all of his attacks and destroy Hiriko with relative ease, so there's not much to go off of. Hiriko also has no answers for Deidara when it comes to his speed, especially when he's flying. In fact, we even see Sasori attempt to attack Deidara while he was in close range, and Deidara easily reacts and dodges the attack. Now, the durability of Hiriko is a bit odd to scale, just because the first time it ever got hit, it was smashed into pieces. This done by Sakura, who prior destroyed the massive boulder protecting the Akatsuki hideout. So if you want to be generous, you could say that Hiriko scales above it, since it did protect Sasori from taking any damage from Sakura's punch. But when it comes to Deidara's bombs, Hiriko has no chance of taking any one of them. except for maybe C1. But any higher level bombs absolutely destroyed the puppet, and even if you want to argue about Hiriko being able to dodge them, the puppet has no speed feats to go off of. So overall, Deidara absolutely destroys Sasori with his Hiriko puppet. It's not really a fight, to be honest. Now this fight between Deidara and the third Kazekage puppet is going to be the most difficult to talk about, as there are many factors to consider when trying to figure out who is going to win. But before I get into this, let's briefly talk about the third Kazekage. So during his reign, the third Kazekage was the strongest shinobi in the Sand Village. His power and skill were suspected and feared by many Sand shinobi, including Sasori, with statements that do imply him to being the strongest Kazekage of all time. However, there is evidence to suggest that this statement is not completely true, as in the original kanji, it states that the third Kazekage was the strongest of all Kage that came before, which would mean that his overall power is superior to that of the first and second Kazekage and not Raza and Gaara. So this brings his scaling into question, as if this is true, it kind of hurts the hype of Sasori taking him down. However, he wields the Iron Sand, the most feared weapon in the history of the Sand Village, more feared than that of the gold dust used by the 4th Kazekage or the tail beast Shikaku used by the 5th. On top of that, the Iron Sand is heavier than regular sand, meaning it can overpower it in a head-to-head clash similar to that of the gold dust, and it's more versatile when it comes to usage, making it a more powerful and dangerous weapon in comparison. So you could still argue that the third is stronger than both Raza and Gaara, just based off him having a superior technique. And once becoming a puppet, the third Kazekage retained the Iron Sand Jutsu, which allowed him dominance over any other puppet he faced against, and he's possibly stronger than when he was alive due to all of the modifications made by Sasori. So to start off the battle, let me just say that the win con for Deidara is in destroying the puppet, which should be easy considering that it has 0 durability feats or scaling that proves it can withstand even one of Deidara's explosives, including C1, unless you think that the puppet scales to Deidara, who was shown capable of taking his own C1 explosive during his fight with Sasuke. But the Iron Sand, however, makes this win condition difficult to achieve, as seen in this fight with Gaara, Deidara's bombs do struggle to bypass the sand defenses, which makes this somewhat tricky to call, as you can argue that the Iron Sand can block most if not all of Deidara's attacks. Now, Deidara does find a way of getting around the sand defenses, so you could say he could use the same tactic as before, that being to sacrifice his arm in order to embed the sand with his explosives. However, those same tactics would be useless in the fight against Sasori for a few reasons. First off, if Deidara gets damaged by the sand in any way, then it's game over, as the sand is laced with Sasori's poison, a poison that is so strong that even a medical expert like Chiyo couldn't cure it. Secondly, for these tactics to work, it requires Sasori to be heavily defensive with the Iron Sand. Now just to be clear, I am not saying he can't use it for defense, but Sasori's fighting style tends to be more offensive and somewhat reckless due to his impatient nature. Aside from that, Deidara normally fights from a distance, shooting powerful explosives at his enemies, making close range engagement a non-factor. So most of the third Kazekage's hidden weapons are useless, making the Iron Sand Sasori's only weapon capable of taking out Deidara. Now unlike Gaara's Sand, the third Kazekage's Iron Sand overall speed and AP is contingent on the shape it takes. This can be supported when looking at the description of the Iron Sand shower, stating the sand is formed into small bullets that can move so fast that it can't be seen by the naked eye, making them hard to avoid. In comparison, Gaara's Sand speed is contingent on its quality, as throughout the manga, the speed of Gaara's sand was dependent on whether it came from the gourd or the area itself, as it's well known that the sand from Gaara's gourd is much faster in comparison to normal sand, which he uses for both offense and defense. Now when it comes to the speed of the Iron Sand, it's really odd to determine how fast it is due to his lack of showings, but from what we do see, Chiyo is able to react to the Iron Sand multiple times during the fight, saving Sakura from being hit and even blocking it. But considering how strong the third Kazekage was and the statements about him, you could maybe say that the Iron Sand speed scales too early where Gaara's Sand, but that's being generous due to the statements. So with this info, it should mean that Sasori will be able to block any attack from Deidara. Also, with the Iron Sand's versatility of being the perfect weapon for any situation, you could say that as a shield, it would provide better defense than what Gaara's Sand provided. Now if it comes down to a drawn out battle between the two, the alternative outcome would be Deidara running out of clay, making Sasori the decisive winner. Now I know this is a very ratty argument, but there are moments in this series where Deidara does in fact run out of clay to use, so that would mean he will have no way to defend himself against Sasori. And also, there isn't a known limit to how much sand the third Kazekage puppet can produce, meaning that in the long run, Sasori is going to have the upper hand against Deidara. Now let's talk about Deidara versus Sasori in his true form. He's no longer subjugated to the weaknesses of a human, such as fatigue or pain. With his body, he's able to shoot out fire from his hands and possesses many weapons that are laced with poison, such as spinning blades and the cable with a stinger at the end. Alongside that, he is also able to control 100 puppets simultaneously, a feat that no other puppet master was able to achieve. But his most important feature is the core on his chest, because as long as the core is unharmed, Sasori can recover from any damage his puppet body sustains and can even switch to other puppets if necessary, essentially making him immortal. So in this matchup, Sasori is at his strongest. With over 100 puppets and his immortality, he can overwhelm opponents he faces. This is demonstrated for a short time against Chio and Sakura. However, it won't be nearly as easy because he possesses a very powerful arsenal of bombs that should be capable of destroying Sasori and any one of his puppets. This can be proven by viewing chapter 273, where Chio and Sakura are easily combating against them and for the most part one-shotting them, making Deidara's weakest bombs a threat against Sasori, as it condemns the likes of the tailed beast. Not to mention Deidara possesses even more powerful bombs, that being C2 and C3, one of which is able to harm Version 2 Sasuke, a shinobi who is a rival of the Akatsuki, and the other is capable of destroying an entire village. On top of that, both have a large destruction radius, meaning that Deidara can easily destroy multiple puppets with a single attack. When it comes to speed, Sasori doesn't have anything to go off of, as the only time he's ever moving is when he's being roped in by his cable to attack Chio. Now you could assume that he is as fast or faster than the third Kazekage puppet, which is shown to outspeeding Sakura. But in comparison to Deidara's speed, feats, and scaling, he doesn't seem to match up. Now there's another aspect of this fight I want to go over, as I do think it drastically impacts the outcome. The statement I mentioned earlier in this video about how Deidara claims that Sasori was stronger than himself does seem to be relevant when it comes to this particular fight. As in chapter 516, we learn that Deidara has knowledge about Sasori's real body and its core, which means that when making this claim, he was referring to Sasori's puppet body. Now keep in mind he only talks about the core and nothing else, so it's unknown if he has knowledge about Sasori's abilities. So this could mean that Deidara, in his own opinion, doesn't think that even with his powerful explosives that he could take down Sasori on his own. If this is true, then Sasori with his army of puppets should be able to defeat him. But this is really based off your interpretation of the statement, especially since Deidara has the AP that should be able to take out the puppets and Sasori himself. But let me know what you guys think in the comments below on who would win between these two. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.